In October of 1858, on a sugar estate south of New Orleans, the plantation bell rang once at 2:40 in the morning. No one had pulled the rope. It had been tied above the platform after the evening count, looped twice around the beam and sealed with wax because the owner feared an alarm during grinding season. Still, the bell sounded. One deep note rolled across the cane fields, crossed the slave quarters, and died over the black water beyond the levee. By sunrise, Mara Vale was gone. She was 33 years old, black, enslaved, and literate. She kept the infirmary register, counted medicine, copied crop figures, and prepared the lists that told the overseer who was sick enough to remain in bed and who would be forced back into the fields. Her pallet was made. Her work dress hung from its peg. Her shoes were missing, along with a dark wool shawl and a small tin cup. Nothing else, no broken latch, no blood. No footprint clear enough to follow through the crushed cane around the yard. The owner sent riders toward the river road before breakfast. Patrols checked flatboats, ferries, churches, free black neighborhoods, and every cabin within 20 miles. A reward notice described Mara as dangerous in one particular way. She could read contracts, she could write names, and she understood the estate's books better than the men who signed them. For 26 days, the search found nothing. Then a storm split the oak frame above the plantation bell. When the blacksmith lowered the bell for repairs, a narrow cavity appeared inside the wooden yoke. Packed into it was a waxed cloth bundle containing 14 pages in Mara's hand. They were not a farewell. They were not a plea. They were a second account of Providence Bend Plantation. 4 grinding seasons, 17 missing people, 63 altered entries, and more than $1,800 in loans, supplies, and crop advances charged against human beings who were already dead, already sold, or recorded twice. The master had believed Mara was keeping his estate in order. She had been measuring how much of that order was built on disappearance, and before she vanished, she made sure the record could travel farther than he could. Providence Bend stood along a slow curve of the Mississippi in St. James Parish, where the river looked broad enough to carry anything away but moved with the patience of something that remembered every bank it touched. The estate covered nearly 700 acres. A little more than 400 were planted in cane. 88 enslaved people lived and worked there through the autumn of 1858, though the number changed depending on which document one read. The field roll listed 88. The ration book listed 93. The collateral schedule held by a New Orleans lender listed 97. No one outside the counting room had reason to compare them. That difference was where the money lived. Providence Bend belonged to Augustin Duval, 42 years old, educated in New Orleans, careful with his clothes, careful with his voice, and most careful with the impression that nothing on his estate happened without design. He was not the richest planter in the parish, but he was considered one of the most efficient. His cane fields were drained in straight lines. His mill ran late without appearing chaotic. His sugar hogsheads reached the city on time. His credit held through bad weather. At church, men asked his opinion about labor discipline and river freight. At dinner, he spoke of order as though it were a moral quality. He liked systems because systems made cruelty look impersonal. The bell marked those systems. It rang before dawn, it rang at noon, it rang when the mill shifted crews. It rang when a fire broke out, when someone tried to run, when the river threatened the levee. Its sound did not ask, it assigned. Mara worked beneath that sound, but not in the fields. She had been moved into the infirmary after a fever season in 1854, when the plantation's hired physician discovered that she could identify letters on medicine labels. No one agreed on how she had learned. Some said an elderly nun had shown her the alphabet, when Mara was a child near Baton Rouge. Others said she learned by matching shipping marks on crates and listening when white children recited lessons on a gallery. Mara never explained. What mattered to Duval was usefulness. The infirmary was a narrow brick building behind the great house, close enough for supervision, and far enough away that sickness would not disturb dinner. It held 6 wooden cots, 2 shelves of bottles, a locked cabinet, and a table stained by years of vinegar, blood, molasses, and lamp smoke. Mara recorded fevers, burns, crushed hands, infected cuts, births, deaths, doses, and returns to labor. The doctor visited twice a week during grinding season and less often when the roads were bad. He dictated, Mara wrote. When cane knives opened a leg, she wrote the name. When the mill rollers took fingers, she wrote the hour. When an exhausted worker collapsed beside the kettles, she wrote the temperature, the medicine issued, and whether the person stood at the next morning's bell. Her register was supposed to be medical, but the plantation made medicine part of accounting. Every day away from work had a cost. Every bottle of laudanum had a price. Every burial meant a change in the value of Duval's property. So the infirmary book traveled. It moved from Mara's table to the overseer's desk, from the overseer's desk to the counting room, and sometimes from the counting room into the documents sent to banks and factors in New Orleans. That was how Mara began to see the gaps. The first was a man named Caleb. He worked in the boiling house, where cane juice moved through open kettles over continuous fire. In November of 1854, a copper ladle slipped from a hook. Boiling syrup struck his chest and left arm. Mara treated him for 9 days. She wrote every change in his condition. On the 10th morning, Caleb stopped breathing before the dawn bell. The doctor signed the line beside his name. Duval ordered the burial before noon. 3 weeks later, Mara was asked to copy a collateral list for a crop advance. Caleb's name was on it, not crossed out, not marked dead. Valued at $900 and pledged with 14 others against the next year's sugar. Mara paused with the pen above the page. The counting clerk noticed. Something wrong? She looked at Caleb's name again. Then at the man watching her. No, sir. She copied it exactly. That night, she wrote the name a second time on a strip torn from a discarded invoice. Caleb, November 19th. Burned in boiling house. Died before dawn. Buried south of the old fig tree. Still pledged on December loan. It was the first entry in a record that would take 4 years to complete. Mara did not begin with a plan to destroy Duval. She began because the official page had denied what her own hands had touched. That difference mattered. The estate could force her to write a lie. It could not force her to forget the body. Over the next year, the pattern widened. A woman named Bess was sent away after an argument with the overseer. Duval said she had been sold to a plantation near Thibodaux. No bill of sale passed through the counting room. No payment appeared. Yet 3 months later, a charge for winter cloth was still entered beside her name. A boy named Samuel, 14 years old, vanished after a night punishment at the cane shed. The field roll called him transferred. The ration book called him absent. The lender's schedule still counted him at full value. A cooper named Henri was sold in New Orleans in March of 1856. Mara saw the sale receipt because she copied the buyer's address. In June, Henri's name appeared again on a list of skilled workers supporting a new loan for mill repairs. 1 person, 2 values, 2 sets of paper, only 1 body, already gone. Mara began to understand that Providence Bend did not have 1 population. It had several. There were the people who woke to the bell, the people the ration book claimed to feed, the people the lender believed Duval still owned, and the people who existed only long enough on paper to make the estate look stronger than it was. The numbers were never wildly different. That was the intelligence of the fraud. 4 extra names here, 3 delayed removals there. A medicine charge shifted forward. A burial expense hidden under lamp oil. A sale recorded in one book and postponed in another. No single discrepancy was large enough to alarm a merchant handling thousands of dollars in sugar. Together, they formed the invisible foundation beneath Duval's credit. Mara kept the official infirmary register clean. Her handwriting remained even. Her totals matched the doctor's notes. Her columns closed without correction. But every time a name changed meaning between one book and another, she created a duplicate entry on paper no one was supposed to see. She used scraps first. Then she acquired better sheets through Isaiah Rook, a free black cooper who traveled between plantations repairing casks before they were shipped to New Orleans. Isaiah came to Providence Bend 3 or 4 times a year. He was in his late 40s, gray at the temples, broad through the shoulders, and skilled enough that white planters complained about his prices while continuing to hire him. He and Mara rarely spoke alone. They did not need to. A request for barrel hoops could carry another meaning. A question about river height could ask whether the road was watched. A folded receipt placed under a coil of hemp could travel farther than a person under patrol. The first time Mara gave him a page, Isaiah did not open it. He slipped it inside his coat. "What is it?" he asked. "Something that needs another shore." He studied her face. "How many shores?" "As many as it can reach." That answer changed the work. From then on, Mara did not keep a single secret record. She kept layers. One set remained hidden at Providence Bend. One moved downriver with Isaiah. A third was reconstructed from memory whenever paper was available. She used the plantation's own structure against itself. The same boats that carried sugar carried copies. The same invoices that hid names gave her dates. The same credit system that made Duval powerful connected him to men beyond the parish, who could be made to fear a false signature. Mara did not believe those men cared about Caleb, Bess, Samuel, or Henri. She understood something colder. They cared whether the numbers securing their money were real. So she built a record that spoke in 2 languages at once. One language was human. Names, injuries, nights, graves, empty beds. The other was financial. Values, dates, loans, duplicate pledges, missing receipts. Compassion could be ignored. Fraud was harder. By the grinding season of 1857, Mara had documented 11 names. She created 3 small marks to organize them. A circle meant dead but retained on paper. A cut line meant sold but still charged to the estate. A square meant counted twice in separate financial documents. The marks were simple enough to look like clerical notation if glimpsed from a distance. The explanations were kept elsewhere. Every few months, she matched the private entries against the official books. Her method depended on accuracy. If she exaggerated one date, Duval could call all of it invention. If she misstated one amount, a lender could dismiss the rest as confusion. So she checked everything twice. A doctor's visit against an invoice, a burial against a ration reduction, a sale against a shipping receipt, a loan schedule against the field roll read aloud at evening count. She never used the word murder. She never wrote monster. She recorded what happened, who was present, what the books later claimed, and where the difference produced money. Her restraint made the pages more dangerous than accusation. Duval could deny hatred. He could not easily deny arithmetic. For almost 3 years, no one suspected. Then Amos disappeared. Amos was a mill mechanic, enslaved, 38, with a scar across his chin and a habit of listening to machinery as if it were speaking. He could identify a loose bearing by sound. During grinding season, that skill could save a hand or prevent a boiler from rupturing. On the night of September 22nd, 1858, the main crusher jammed. Amos ordered the feed stopped. The overseer, Silas Crane, accused him of delaying production. Duval arrived from the house while the mill crew stood in steam and darkness. Amos insisted a gear tooth had cracked. Duval ordered the mill restarted. Amos refused to place his hand near the housing until the gear was inspected. The argument lasted less than 2 minutes. By dawn, Amos was gone. Duval said he had been sent to another estate for discipline. Crane said he had been sold before sunrise. The driver said nothing. Mara checked the infirmary register. No entry. She checked the field roll. Amos's name remained. She checked the maintenance account. A payment of $40 had been entered for night transport and skilled replacement. There was no replacement. 3 days later, the cracked gear failed. 2 men were injured. The mill stopped for 16 hours. Duval blamed Amos. Mara knew then that the record was no longer only about people who had already vanished. It was about the next name, and the next one might be hers. The danger announced itself in a small way. On October 3rd, Duval entered the infirmary without the doctor. He stood beside Mara's table while she totaled quinine and bandages. "You have a clean hand," he said. "Yes, sir." "Cleaner than my clerk," she kept writing. "Do you ever make private copies?" The pen stopped, only for a breath, then it moved again. "Copies of what, sir?" He smiled without warmth. "That is not an answer." Mara set the pen down. "I copy what I am told." Duval looked at the shelves, the locked cabinet, the register, the wastebasket beneath the table. "Paper goes missing. Paper is used. Everything here is used." His eyes returned to her. "That does not mean everything here is free to choose its purpose." He left the room. Mara waited until his footsteps faded. Then she took the private packet from beneath a loose floor brick and moved it before sunset. That same evening, Duval ordered the infirmary waste burned. 2 days later, he replaced the counting clerk. A week after that, Isaiah Rook failed to arrive on the date they had arranged. The river was low. The roads were passable. No storm had delayed him. For the first time in 4 years, Mara did not know whether a copy had reached another shore. Pressure closed around Providence Bend. Crane searched cabins for paper. The evening count was repeated twice. Passes were inspected under lamplight. A patrol rode the levee after midnight. The bell rope was pulled up and tied after the last shift, so no one could signal the river. Duval began reviewing the infirmary register himself. He asked why medicine had been issued to people no longer listed in the quarters. He asked why burial dates did not always match ration changes. He asked why Mara remembered the names of people gone for years. She answered only what the page required. But the system that had made her useful was turning toward her. On October 9th, she overheard Duval and Crane outside the counting room. Crane wanted her questioned immediately. Duval refused. "Not while the books are open," he said. "She knows where every correction sits, then close them." "I intend to." There was a pause, then paper moved. "Racine's trader comes Thursday." Mara stood behind the door with a tray of medicine bottles in her hands. Thursday was 2 days away. She understood the sentence. She would be sold before the grinding accounts closed. Taken west, perhaps. Taken upriver, placed somewhere no one knew her handwriting. The plantation had begun by erasing other names. Now it would erase the person who had remembered them. That night, Mara went to the quarters of Josiah Bell, the plantation blacksmith. Josiah was 56. Thick-handed, slow-spoken, and trusted with every iron object Duval feared to leave broken. He repaired plow points, chains, hinges, mill fittings, and the bolts holding the plantation bell above its platform. He had known Mara since she was brought to Providence Bend at 19. She placed a waxed bundle on his workbench. He did not touch it. "Is this the thing they are looking for?" "One of them." "How many?" "Enough." "Enough for what?" Mara looked toward the dark shape of the bell beyond the forge. "Enough that burning one will not end it." Josiah's eyes followed hers. The bell hung from an oak yoke he had rebuilt the previous spring. A storm crack ran along one end, sealed with resin and iron pins. He understood before she explained. If they lower it, they will find the packet, and if they do not, then it waits. For whom? For a day when the bell no longer means what it means now. Josiah looked back at her. What are you going to do? Mara did not say run. Running described movement. What she had planned was distribution. She told him only what he needed to know. Before dawn on Thursday, the cane barge Mercy would leave the estate landing with empty casks bound for New Orleans. Its deckhand owed Isaiah Rook a debt. A space beneath the forward planks could hide a person for the first 6 river miles. If the patrol stayed on the road, she might reach the city. If the boat was searched, she would not. If Isaiah had been arrested, the route beyond New Orleans might already be closed. Josiah listened. Then he asked the question neither of them wanted to answer. Why ring the bell? Mara looked at the iron mouth above them. Because they tied the rope. He almost smiled. Almost. The bell was Duval's voice. One strike in the night would tell the quarters that something had changed. It would also pull every eye toward the platform while Mara crossed the yard behind the infirmary. A distraction, a signal, and a last act of theft, not of silver, not of sugar, of authority. The plan depended on 5 people, a river schedule, a loose storm pin, and silence. It nearly failed before it began. On Wednesday afternoon, Crane found a scrap of paper beneath the infirmary table. It contained only 3 names and a column of dates, but one of the names was Amos. Crane brought it to Duval. By dusk, the infirmary was locked. Mara was confined in the pantry beside the kitchen under guard. Racine's trader was expected after sunrise. The packet for the bell was still hidden inside Josiah's forge. The barge would leave at 3. The distance from the pantry to the landing was less than 300 yards. It might as well have been 100 miles. Just after midnight, weather moved in from the Gulf. Not a full hurricane, a grinding season squall. Hard rain struck the gallery. Wind pushed smoke flat across the yard. The mill crew fought to cover cut cane before the water ruined it. Crane pulled the pantry guard toward the boiling house. For 6 minutes, the kitchen passage was empty. Mara had spent years recording small differences. 6 minutes was a difference. She lifted a hearth pin Josiah had loosened days earlier. The pantry latch opened from inside. She crossed the kitchen, stepped into rain, and did not run. Running would draw the eye. She carried a covered pail as though answering an infirmary call. At the forge, Josiah waited beside the bell platform. He had already removed 1 iron pin from the oak yoke. Together they pressed the waxed packet into the narrow cavity and sealed it behind a plug darkened with soot. Then came the part that could not be quiet. Josiah climbed the platform. The rope remained tied above reach. He struck the bell once with a blacksmith's sledge. Every dog on Providence Bend began barking. A guard shouted. Lanterns turned toward the sound. Mara moved the opposite way, across the rear yard, past the infirmary, down the levee path, toward the black shape of the Mercy waiting against the current. She reached the landing. She reached the deck. She lifted the forward plank and saw a rifle resting across the hidden space. The deckhand had been replaced. A white watchman stood at the stern, sheltered under oilcloth. Mara froze. The river slapped the hull. Behind her, men were running from the bell platform. This was the darkest edge of the plan. The route had been exposed. The barge was no longer an escape. The cane fields were flooded with patrols. The road was watched. The infirmary was locked, and the trader would arrive at dawn. For 1 second, Providence Bend had reduced the world to water, mud, and armed men. Then someone beneath the wharf whispered her name, Mara. She looked down. A skiff no wider than a table was pressed into shadow under the landing. Isaiah Rook held one hand against the piling. His other hand gripped the oar. He had missed their meeting because Crane had stopped him on the road and searched his wagon. He had doubled back through the swamp, reached the river after dark, and waited without knowing whether Mara would come. There was no time to speak. She stepped off the landing. The skiff dropped under her weight. Isaiah pushed away. A lantern swung toward the water. Crane reached the levee as the current caught them. He shouted for the watchman to fire. The first shot struck the piling. The second entered the river behind the skiff. Isaiah did not row toward New Orleans. He rowed across the current, toward a line of anchored timber rafts where darkness broke into 100 shapes. Within 30 seconds, the skiff vanished among them. Within 3 minutes, the river had carried them beyond the clear reach of the lanterns. Mara did not look back until Providence Bend was only a row of lights under rain. The bell stood black against the sky. Its rope was still tied. By sunrise, Duval knew she was gone. He knew the bell had been struck by hand. He knew someone had helped her. What he did not know was how many pages had already left before she did. The search began with violence. Cabins were emptied, floorboards lifted, mattresses cut. Josiah's forge was searched twice, but no one thought to dismantle the object used to summon everyone else. Duval increased the reward to $300. He described Mara as a thief of business papers, though he could not identify what papers without revealing that he feared them. Patrols searched the river landings from Donaldsonville to New Orleans. A notice was sent to traders west of Baton Rouge. Duval questioned Josiah until the old blacksmith's lips split. Josiah said he had struck the bell because he thought the storm had loosened it. Duval did not believe him, but disbelief was not proof. The plantation returned to grinding. That was the fiction everyone was ordered to maintain. Cane entered the crusher. Juice filled the kettles. Firemen fed wood through the night. The bell rang at dawn and noon as before. Yet the sound had changed. Everyone had heard the note Mara stole. One command no longer belonged entirely to its owner. 26 days after her disappearance, another storm cracked the repaired yoke. This time the bell tilted. Duval ordered Josiah to lower it. The packet fell from the split oak and landed in the mud between them. For a moment, neither man moved. Josiah knew what it contained. Duval knew only that it had been hidden. He snatched it first. The waxed cloth was dry inside. 14 pages, Mara's handwriting. The first page listed the estate's 4 populations: field roll, ration book, lender schedule, actual count. The second explained the symbols. The next 10 pages gave names, dates, injuries, sales, burials, and financial entries. The final 2 pages traced the loans. 1 crop advance secured by Caleb after Caleb's death. A mill repair note supported by Henri after Henri's sale. Supply charges collected for Bess after her disappearance. 2 separate schedules counting Samuel. Repeated small differences that produced more than $1,800 over 4 years. Not a fortune by the scale of Providence Bend. Enough to prove design. Enough to make every larger number suspect. At the bottom of the last page, Mara had written one sentence: "This copy is not the first and will not be the last." Duval read the packet in the counting room with the shutters closed. He read it once as an owner, then again as a borrower. The second reading frightened him more. As an owner, he saw disobedience. As a borrower, he saw the collapse of trust. Providence Bend depended on annual credit. Sugar required barrels, iron, mules, medicine, repairs, and food before the crop reached market. Duval's standing allowed him to borrow against cane not yet cut and people whose value appeared stable on paper. If the paper was false, the credit was false. If the credit was false, the estate could not wait for the next harvest to save it. Duval burned the 14 pages before midnight. He watched every corner blacken. He stirred the ashes until no name remained legible. Then he slept for less than an hour, because the sentence at the bottom had not burned with the page. It remained in his head. Not the first, not the last. The first demand arrived from New Orleans 6 days later. It came from Bell and Caro. the commercial house that financed Providence-Ben's barrel orders and held 2 of Duval's crop notes. The letter was polite. It requested clarification of discrepancies between his current collateral schedule and an independently supplied list of deaths and transfers. It named Caleb, Henri, Samuel. It enclosed no accusation. It simply suspended a pending advance until the figures were reconciled. Duval wrote back the same day. He called the information malicious. He blamed clerical delay. He promised corrected documents. A second letter arrived before his reply could reach the city. This one came from a shipping insurer. It asked why a man sold in March of 1856 had appeared on a skilled labor schedule in June. A third arrived from a notary who had witnessed one of the earlier pledges. It requested a sworn inventory. The letters did not come from the same hand. That was Mara's design. No single office held the entire record. Each held enough to question one piece. Each question forced Duval to answer with another document, and every answer risked contradicting a different page already somewhere else. He could not chase ink because the ink had separated. One copy traveled through business, one through a church relief network, one through free black craftsmen who knew which names had actually passed through New Orleans. The truth did not need one powerful protector. It needed enough small custodians that no one person could be forced to surrender all of it. Duval summoned his attorney. The attorney asked to see the official books. The field roll showed 88. The ration book showed 93. The collateral schedule showed 97. "Which number is correct?" the attorney asked. Duval stared at him. "The estate changes daily. Then why do the dead remain valuable longer than the living remain fed?" Duval ended the meeting. He ordered the ration book rewritten. The new clerk refused to alter dates without written instruction. He dismissed the clerk. He told Crane to locate Isaiah Rook. Isaiah had disappeared from his usual route. He told patrols to search New Orleans. New Orleans contained nearly 170,000 people. Ships from half the Atlantic, streets where a name could change before breakfast, and free black communities whose networks Duval had never needed to understand. Authority weakened with distance. His ended at the parish line. Mara had built her plan around that fact. The fourth letter came in December. It contained a copied paragraph in her hand and a condition. Providence-Ben would submit a corrected inventory, listing every person who had died, been sold, or been removed since 1854. The correction would be circulated to every lender holding an interest in the estate. No private acknowledgement, no quiet replacement page, a corrected record. Duval refused. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Then Bell and Caro declined to release money for spring planting. The barrel supplier demanded cash. The physician reduced visits until old balances were paid. A mule dealer canceled delivery. The estate still had land. It still had cane. It still had people forced to work. But the machinery around that coercion had begun to seize. Credit was the oil. Mara had contaminated it with names. The consequences did not fall only on Duval. That was the cruelest part. Rations tightened. Repairs were delayed. Crane increased field hours to recover losses. People who had not written a single line suffered because a planter's fraud had been exposed. Mara had anticipated that possibility. But anticipation could not make it clean. There was no clean weapon available to an enslaved woman inside a system designed to turn every disruption against the enslaved first. Her record could break Duval's invisibility. It could not instantly break the world that made him possible. That truth belongs in the story. By January of 1859, Providence-Ben's corrected inventory had still not been filed. The lenders sent an examiner. He arrived with 2 clerks and spent 4 days comparing books. They counted the quarters at dawn. They inspected burial expenses. They matched sale receipts to names. They found more than Mara had written, not because she had missed the truth, because she had documented only what she could prove. The examiner identified 21 questionable entries across 5 years. 9 people retained on financial schedules after death or sale. 4 counted in more than one instrument. 8 supported by records too inconsistent to verify. The amount placed at risk exceeded $6,000 once the challenged loans were combined. The exact sum mattered less than the result. Providence Bend's paper was no longer trusted. Duval finally agreed to file a corrected inventory. He did not do it out of conscience. He did it because refusal would trigger immediate foreclosure. The document was prepared in the counting room where Mara had copied so many of the earlier lies. For the first time, Caleb's death appeared beside the loan that had continued to use his value. Henri's sale was entered against the later mill note. Samuel was removed from both schedules. Bess was listed as unverified rather than transferred. Amos was listed as missing. Duval signed at the bottom. His signature did not free anyone. It did something narrower and still powerful. It forced the estate to admit that the names had meanings beyond convenience. The correction reached New Orleans in February. The credit suspension remained. Trust did not return because the truth had finally been written. The truth explained why trust had been misplaced. The 1859 planting began late. A boiler repair consumed money Duval did not have. Floodwater entered the lower cane fields in April. By summer, he had mortgaged silver, horses, and a portion of the next crop. Crane left for another estate. He told people Duval had become weak. What he meant was that Duval could no longer guarantee protection for the men who enforced his order. The plantation bell kept ringing, but fewer people believed the sound represented control. It represented schedule. Control required everyone else to accept the schedule's authority. That acceptance was gone. In October of 1859, exactly 1 year after Mara disappeared, Providence Bend entered forced sale. The land, mill, livestock, and human beings were divided among separate buyers to satisfy different claims. There was no triumphant emancipation. Families faced the danger of separation. Children were held close at the appraisal yard. Men memorized buyers' names. Women repeated destinations under their breath so someone might carry them later. Duval lost the estate. The enslaved community did not receive the freedom his ruin seemed to promise. History is often dishonest when it confuses the fall of one powerful man with the fall of the system that made him powerful. Mara's victory was not that suffering ended. It was that erasure failed. Josiah was purchased with the blacksmith shop by a smaller planter upriver. Before leaving Providence Bend, he removed the iron pin from the cracked bell yoke and kept it hidden in his shoe. The bell itself was sold to a church. The great house remained. The mill continued under a new name. But the corrected inventory traveled with the creditor files. So did one of Mara's surviving packets. Names that Duval had treated as movable figures now existed in documents outside his control. Caleb, Bess, Samuel, Henri, Amos, and 12 others. That record later helped 2 families trace where relatives had been sold. It allowed a widow to prove that her husband had not abandoned her, as Duval's field roll had claimed. It gave a former mill worker a date for Amos's disappearance. It did not restore the dead. It did not reunite everyone. But it prevented Providence Bend from deciding alone what had happened. As for Mara, the trail becomes uncertain after New Orleans. A free black seamstress on Dauphine Street later told her children that a woman named Mary Vale stayed in her back room during the winter of 1858. A church ledger from Cincinnati recorded a M. Vale receiving travel money the following spring. A letter preserved by Isaiah Rook's family mentioned Philadelphia, and the woman whose pages arrived before she did. None of those clues prove where Mara settled. That may have been the point. She had spent 4 years making other people's identities harder to erase. She owed no archive the location of her own. What survived clearly was her method. She did not rely on one witness. She did not rely on one honest white official. She did not place everything in one dramatic confession that could be seized and burned. She separated the truth into pieces. She matched human memory to commercial records. She made men who ignored suffering pay attention to risk. She understood the plantation more completely than its owner did, because she saw both systems at once. The system that commanded bodies and the system that converted those bodies into numbers. Duval believed literacy made her useful. He never understood that usefulness created access. Access created comparison. Comparison created proof. And proof, once copied, created distance from power. Augustin Duval moved to New Orleans after the sale and spent years disputing the final balance of the estate. His name disappeared from parish committees. His letters became defensive, then infrequent. He died before the Civil War with no plantation and no restored reputation. Providence Bend changed owners twice before Union troops moved through the river parishes. The mill was damaged. The quarters were abandoned. The bell, removed years earlier, continued ringing from a church tower until its oak frame split for good. Josiah's iron pin survived in his family. So did 3 copied pages, folded and refolded until the creases nearly separated. On one page beside Caleb's name, Mara had drawn a circle. On another, besides Henri, a cut line. On the last, beneath the totals, she wrote that an account was not true simply because a powerful man closed it. For years, Providence Bend had turned cane into sugar and people into figures. Mara reversed the process. She turned figures back into people. The sugar dissolved, the names did not.